the delicate, crystal-clear notes of the string quartet playing softly in the background of our spectacular, million-dollar wedding reception were violently shattered by the loud, aggressive screech of microphone feedback. The sudden, ear-piercing noise echoed harshly through the cavernous grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan, instantly cutting through the polite, low murmurs of our 300 elite guests. I flinched, my hands instinctively gripping the edge of the pristine white sweetheart table, where I sat next to my new husband, Julian. The romantic, carefully curated ambiance of what was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life evaporated in a single, devastating second. My father, Marcus, a ruthlessly competitive patriarch who had built a massive, $900 million luxury hospitality empire from the ground up, stormed onto the raised dais. He did not look like a proud, loving father celebrating the joyous union of his youngest daughter. He did not have tears of happiness in his eyes. With his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his jaw locked in a furious, aggressive grind, he looked exactly like a corporate raider executing a hostile, bloody takeover. Without offering a single word of warning or apology, he ripped the heavy silver microphone directly from the hands of the best man, right in the absolute middle of a heartfelt, emotional toast. The entire grand ballroom, a glittering, opulent sea of the city's most prominent, wealthy socialites, influential politicians and ruthless business moguls, fell into a stunned, breathless silence. You could literally hear a pin drop over the massive, imported floral arrangements. Marcus marched over to our sweetheart table, his expensive Italian leather shoes echoing loudly, like gunshots on the polished hardwood floor. He did not offer me a warm paternal smile. He did not lean in for a congratulatory embrace. Instead, he slammed a thick, intimidating stack of heavily stapled legal documents directly onto the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The violent, aggressive force of the impact knocked over my expensive crystal champagne flute, sending a rushing river of vintage Dom Perignon spilling aggressively over the edge of the table. The crystal shattered loudly onto the floor, and the freezing liquid splashed onto the intricate, handcrafted lace hem of my custom bridal gown. You really, honestly thought I would just stand back and let this pathetic embarrassment happen? My father's voice boomed through the microphone, harsh, furious, and unforgiving, echoing loudly off the crystal chandeliers hanging directly above us. You really thought you could bring this absolute, monumental disgrace into our prestigious family, and I would just smile politely for the society cameras and foot the massive bill. I stared down at the thick legal documents, the harsh, bold black ink stark and terrifying against the heavy, expensive white paper. It was a formal, legally binding renunciation of assets. I was 29 years old. My name is Maya. I had spent the last 7 years quietly and meticulously navigating complex corporate fraud as a senior asset liquidator for a ruthless, secretive private equity firm in London. I spent my days unearthing the dark, hidden financial secrets of incredibly powerful, dangerous people. Yet, despite my extensive professional training in risk analysis, I had never felt as entirely, profoundly blindsided as I did in this very horrific moment. I analyzed catastrophic corporate disasters for a living, but I had failed to predict that my own flesh and blood would execute a coordinated, vicious public strike at my own wedding reception. Dad, what in the world are you doing? I whispered, my voice shaking violently with a complex mixture of profound shock and crushing public humiliation. Please, stop, not right now, this is my wedding day. You completely lost the absolute right to call this a wedding the exact second you chose him. Marcus sneered, pointing a heavy diamond-ringed finger directly at my new husband Julian, with a look of absolute unadulterated disgust. You actively chose to marry a public high school history teacher. A man earning barely $60,000 a year. A man who brings absolutely no social status, no corporate leverage, and zero financial value to the family legacy I literally broke my back to build. The collective, horrified gasp from the wedding guests was loud and audible. Women wearing expensive, imported silk gowns whispered frantically behind their manicured hands. Men wearing custom, tailored tuxedos shifted uncomfortably in their velvet seats, exchanging wide-eyed, terrified glances. My mother, Cassandra, sat perfectly, rigidly still at the head family table, casually sipping her sparkling water, refusing to meet my desperate eyes as my father tore my entire world apart. Her cold, calculated silence was her absolute endorsement of his cruelty. My father paced aggressively in front of our table, clearly, deeply reveling in the captive, horrified audience, actively turning my personal heartbreak into his own twisted, narcissistic theater. I gave you every single opportunity imaginable, Maya. I offered you the entire world on a shiny silver platter, and you spat directly on it for a pathetic life of absolute mediocrity. He barked into the microphone, ensuring the entire room heard his vicious takedown. You desperately want to be a struggling, impoverished teacher's wife. Fine. I will grant your wish, but you will not do it on my dime. Sign the papers. He tapped the thick documents aggressively, his heavy ring leaving a visible indentation on the crisp white page. This is a total, irreversible renunciation of your $7 million trust fund. You are entirely cut off, you are publicly disowned, effective immediately. You will not receive a single, solitary penny of my hard-earned inheritance. Before I could even begin to process the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his massive public execution, the sharp, rapid click of designer heels sounded loudly against the polished floor. My older sister, Victoria, strutted confidently up to the sweetheart table. She was wearing a custom, heavily beaded couture gown that was arguably significantly more elaborate, much brighter, and certainly far more revealing than my own traditional bridal dress. She stood directly next to our father, a smug, triumphant, sickening smile plastered permanently across her perfectly contoured face, actively acting as his loyal, vicious enforcer. She casually, deliberately adjusted her incredibly heavy, blinding diamond tennis bracelet, holding her wrist up just long enough to ensure the bright ballroom lighting caught the expensive stones perfectly. You really should have just listened to Mom, Maya, Victoria said, leaning into the microphone my father held. You easily could have married someone with actual, verifiable status. Someone who truly knows how to provide luxury and protect a legacy, exactly like my brilliant husband, Preston. She gestured grandly, dramatically toward the front row of exclusive VIP tables where her husband, Preston, sat comfortably, flashing his massive gold Rolex and leaning back in his chair with an arrogant, self-satisfied grin. Preston was the chief financial officer of my father's hospitality empire. He looked exactly like the picture-perfect image of fake, aggressive wealth, a man desperately playing a role he had not genuinely earned himself. Victoria leaned over our wet champagne-soaked table, her dark eyes filled with undisguised, toxic venom. But you just always had to be the incredibly difficult one, didn't you? You flatly declined the legacy admission to Harvard Business School, just to stubbornly prove a pathetic point. You actively threw away the elite networking, the powerful social connections, and the legacy country club memberships Mom tried so desperately to hand you, all to forge your own pathetic, boring little path. And just look exactly where it got you. You are a stubborn, broke embarrassment to this entire family. She laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. You always thought you were so much better than the elite social clubs. So much better than the charity galas. Remember, when you flat out refused to wear the incredible designer gown Mom bought you for the debutante ball, actively choosing to buy your own cheap, off-the-rack dress instead? You have always desperately wanted to be poor, Maya. Dad is just formally granting your ultimate wish. Sign the papers, go pay for your own miserable, pathetic life. My heart pounded violently, aggressively against my ribs. I looked slowly over at Julian, fully expecting him to be flushed bright red with extreme humiliation. I expected him to be angry, perhaps ready to stand up, shout, and fight my father to defend his honor and our marriage. But Julian did not flinch, he did not yell, he did not look embarrassed. His body language was terrifyingly calm, almost unnervingly still. He sat tall, straight in his elegant chair, his tailored charcoal suit completely unwrinkled, exuding a quiet, immense, devastating authority that seemed entirely out of place for a supposed public school teacher being publicly berated and mocked by a billionaire hospitality patriarch. He did not look like a victim, he looked like a king observing a foolish jester. He gently, smoothly reached out and took the heavy silver pen directly from my shaking, terrified fingers. His touch was warm and steady, instantly grounding my panic in the absolute midst of my toxic family's chaotic, cruel theatrical performance. Julian looked slowly up at my father, a serene, almost deeply pitying smile resting quietly on his handsome face. He pulled the thick, intimidating stack of legal documents smoothly toward himself. He did not bother to aggressively read the fine print. He did not ask to consult an outside lawyer, and he absolutely did not beg for a single moment to consider the financial ramifications of the paperwork. He simply flipped straight to the very last page, quickly locating the spousal waiver of financial claims, and signed his name with fluid, incredibly confident, sweeping strokes. He slid the heavy, thick stack of signed papers back across the wet, ruined tablecloth directly toward Marcus, pushing it right over the spilled vintage champagne. "We do not need a single penny of your money, sir," Julian said calmly. His voice was not artificially amplified by a microphone, but it carried clearly, steadily, and powerfully in the silent, deeply tense room. "May your fragile wealth keep you warm at night, because your toxic family certainly will not." My father stared blankly at the signature for a brief, confused second before letting out a harsh, barking, arrogant laugh. He snatched the signed papers off the wet tablecloth, clutching them tightly to his chest like a massive lottery grand prize. "Stupid, arrogant pride!" Marcus scoffed loudly, waving the signed renunciation high in the air for the entire elite crowd to see clearly. "You two deserve each other. Have a nice, quiet, miserable life, struggling in the lower middle class." He turned sharply on his heel and stormed aggressively out of the grand ballroom, his head held arrogantly high. Victoria shot me one last, lingering look of absolute, unadulterated disgust before linking arms tightly with Preston and happily following my father out the grand double doors. Within minutes, the brutal, humiliating social exodus began. Over half the wedding guests, specifically the wealthy ones whose businesses, investments, and fragile social standings relied on my father's goodwill and money, stood up in complete unison. They filed quickly out of the reception in massive droves, murmuring awkward, fake apologies, or simply keeping their heads down and actively avoiding my devastated gaze completely. The grand, festive, beautifully decorated ballroom felt suddenly cavernous, incredibly cold, and devastatingly empty. I sat there completely frozen, my chest feeling tight, hot, heavy tears actively threatening to spill over my carefully applied bridal makeup. I had just lost my entire biological family, my financial safety net, and over half my wedding guests in a matter of excruciating, highly public minutes. Julian leaned over, wrapping his strong, comforting arm securely around my trembling waist and pulling me close against his solid side. He leaned in, his warm lips brushing gently against my ear, and his voice dropped to a low, commanding, incredibly powerful whisper that sent a sudden electric shiver directly down my spine. "Do not shed a single solitary tear for them, Maya," Julian whispered, his voice laced with absolute certainty. "Your arrogant father has absolutely no idea what he just did. By forcing us to publicly sign that specific legal waiver today, he just legally, officially signed away his absolute right to family asset protection. The game is officially on, my love." Exactly 1 month had passed since the agonizing, public spectacle at the Pierre Hotel. I sat in my minimalist, ultra-modern private office on the 42nd floor of a towering glass high-rise in downtown Manhattan, staring intensely out at the sprawling concrete jungle below. The walls of my workspace were stark white, intentionally and stripped of any personal photographs, warm paintings or sentimental decorations, perfectly reflecting the cold, deeply calculated nature of my highly secretive profession. I operated as the Senior Director of Global Asset Recovery for Vanguard Heritage, one of the most ruthless, faceless, and massively powerful private equity and debt restructuring firms on Wall Street. My job was not to build struggling companies up or offer strategic, friendly advice to failing entrepreneurs. My job was to surgically dissect massive corporations when they failed, to violently strip away the glossy, fake corporate facade, and to entirely expose the rotting, corrupt financial core hiding underneath. I analyzed catastrophic financial disaster for a living, and today I was staring at a true masterpiece of absolute, unmitigated financial ruin. The serene, absolute silence of my corner office was a stark, jarring contrast to the screaming, arrogant laughing, and intense public humiliation I had endured exactly 30 days prior. Here, in this room, raw numbers absolutely did not lie, and complex spreadsheets did not possess fragile, arrogant egos. The dual high-definition monitors resting on my mahogany desk displayed a labyrinth of hidden offshore accounts, deeply falsified vendor invoices, and severely breached debt covenants. I was currently leading the aggressive compliance audit on a massive, defaulting mezzanine loan portfolio that Vanguard Heritage had recently acquired from a struggling regional bank. The encrypted financial data glowing on my screens painted a crystal clear, undeniable picture of gross, blatant financial negligence and massive illegal corporate activity. I traced the digital paper trail with surgical, unemotional precision. The primary corporate borrower had systematically and repeatedly violated multiple default covenants over the past 3 fiscal quarters. Instead of reinvesting the borrowed capital into operational infrastructure and luxury hotel property upgrades, as strictly mandated by the aggressive loan terms, the executive board had actively siphoned the funds through a highly complex, deeply layered web of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. It was textbook, massive federal wire fraud, executed with a staggering level of sheer carelessness that bordered on entirely comical. I ran a complex cross-reference algorithm on the corporate tax identification numbers, meticulously matching the offshore wire transfers directly back to the parent holding company. I calmly pressed the Enter key to pull up the final consolidated ledger, running a proprietary Vanguard algorithm to unmask the ultimate beneficial owner of the debt. The progress bar loaded swiftly, and the name of the parent company flashed in bold, aggressive red letters across my monitor. It made my breath catch sharply, deeply in my throat. It was Marcus Hospitality Holdings. My father's sprawling, $900 million luxury hotel empire was not just bleeding money. It was actively hemorrhaging cash at a fatal rate, and the digital trail of embezzled corporate funds led directly to the office of his newly appointed, highly arrogant chief financial officer, my brother-in-law, Preston. I stared intensely at the screen, letting the massive magnitude of the terrifying discovery wash completely over me. Preston, the arrogant man who wore custom silk suits, flashed his gold Rolex, and loudly mocked my husband at my wedding, had actively used the hotel empire's primary operating capital as his own personal, limitless piggy bank. He had egregiously breached the critical debt service coverage ratio, instantly triggering an automatic, non-negotiable acceleration clause within the contract. The entire massive loan was now due immediately in full. The sharp, sudden ring of my personal encrypted cell phone shattered the dead silence of my office, pulling my sharp eyes away from the damning evidence glowing on the monitors. I glanced casually at the caller ID flashing on the screen. It was Cassandra, my mother. She had not reached out to me a single time since the exact moment she sat quietly, sipping sparkling water, and watched my father rip my trust fund to shreds at my wedding reception. She had not called to politely ask about my honeymoon, nor had she texted once to see how Julian and I were settling into our married life. I let the phone ring exactly 3 times, slowly savoring the unusual persistence, before finally answering the call. I did not offer a polite, daughterly greeting or ask how she was doing. I simply answered and listened to the heavy, frantic, panicked breathing on the other end of the line. The voice that finally spoke was completely, utterly stripped of its usual polished elite country club haughtiness. Cassandra was practically hyperventilating, her desperate words tumbling out in a frantic, uncoordinated rush that lacked any of her trademark, flawless social grace. She sounded entirely unhinged, demanding aggressively that I pack a bag and drive directly to the family estate in the Hamptons immediately. There were no polite pleasantries, no fake apologies for the ruined wedding, just raw, unfiltered, naked panic echoing loudly through the receiver. I leaned back slowly in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes still fixed intensely on the glowing red numbers, highlighting Preston's massive offshore wire transfers. You have not spoken a single solitary word to me since you told your elite charity committee friends that my wedding reception was a pathetic charity event. I said, keeping my tone flat and completely devoid of any warmth. Why exactly are you calling me now? Did Preston total another imported Ferrari you bought him with company money? Or did the country club finally reject your highly leveraged annual gala proposal? Do not ever speak to me with that disrespectful tone. Cassandra snapped sharply, though the usual venom in her voice was overshadowed by pure, suffocating terror. Marcus' hospitality is frozen. The corporate bank accounts, the credit lines, the payroll vendor payouts. Everything is completely locked down by some faceless, predatory corporate raider. We desperately need you to come here right now and pull a massive second mortgage on your apartment to bail Victoria out. I let out a sharp, incredulous, icy laugh that echoed loudly off the glass walls of my office. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her frantic request was absolutely staggering. I stared directly at the red numbers highlighting Preston's fraudulent wire transfers. You actually want me to heavily leverage my own home, the tiny apartment I bought entirely with my own salary, to bail out the golden child you literally stood by and watched Dad disown me for a month ago? I asked, my voice dripping with cold disbelief. You laughed when he loudly told me I would be living in pathetic poverty because I married a public school teacher. Now you are frantically demanding my money. This is a family emergency, Maya. Cassandra cried, her voice cracking in a high-pitched, pathetic wail I had never heard before. The federal marshals were literally at the corporate headquarters this morning, serving subpoenas. They are actively threatening to completely seize Victoria's personal assets. She is terrified. You have excellent credit, you live exactly like a pauper anyway, so I know you have massive equity. You can take out $1 million equity line against your place and transfer it directly to Preston's legal defense fund by tomorrow morning. Family strictly protects family, Maya. Family protects family. I repeated, the bitter, sickening irony heavy on my tongue. Family protects family. Like the time you locked me outside in the freezing, pouring rain when I was 12 years old, because I accidentally stained my dress right before your prestigious debutante gala? You literally let me stand there shivering on the porch for 3 hours so I would not ruin your perfect, curated socialite family portrait. Or how about when you told all your friends I was a disappointment for flatly refusing to pledge your elite legacy sorority? You have never protected me. Now you want me to bleed myself completely dry to protect your rapidly crumbling fake facade. Stop living in the past, Cassandra shrieked, the panic taking absolute total control of her vocal cords. If Marcus goes down, we absolutely all go down. We will lose the Hamptons estate. I will lose my country club standing. Do you actually want your sister to be homeless? Do you want your father to go to federal prison? I want you to explain to me precisely why Preston needs $1 million legal defense fund, I said calmly, baiting her flawlessly, watching the digital cursor blink on my screen right next to Preston's falsified Cayman Island invoices. What exactly did the brilliant golden CFO son-in-law do? He did nothing wrong. Cassandra hissed defensively, fiercely protecting the arrogant man who had successfully given her the total illusion of high society perfection. It is a massive misunderstanding, a minor clerical error with some aggressive mezzanine debt lenders. Preston is a brilliant financial mind. He just urgently needs temporary liquidity to satisfy a margin call, until the corporate lawyers can officially sort out this aggressive, illegal corporate overreach. You are his sister. You completely owe this family your absolute loyalty. The final pieces of the puzzle snapped together in my mind with a highly satisfying, violent click. My current forensic audit, the severely breached mezzanine loan covenants, the Cayman Island shell corporations, and my mother's desperate, hyperventilating panic were all perfectly, seamlessly aligned. Marcus Hospitality Holdings was not just failing organically due to normal market forces. It was being actively surgically dismantled by the very private equity firm I worked for. I was the exact person holding the scalpel. I looked closely at the executive summary on my screen, explicitly highlighting the exact legal clause that fully authorized the immediate freezing of all operational corporate accounts. I had personally, directly approved that automated digital trigger exactly 72 hours ago. My mother was currently begging me to save them from a massive financial execution that I had personally orchestrated through my daily corporate duties. I will be at the Hamptons estate in exactly 2 hours, I said calmly, ignoring her ongoing, hysterical demands for immediate wire transfer details. I closed my heavy laptop with a definitive, solid snap, permanently severing the digital connection to her ruined empire. Do not do absolutely anything until I get there. I did not agree to drive to the Hamptons to offer a pathetic loan. I did not agree to go there to save my arrogant sister, rescue my cruel father's legacy, or preserve my mother's fake elite social standing. I aggressively grabbed my car keys and my heavy black leather briefcase, feeling the cold, hard weight of the complete audit files hidden inside. I was actively going to the lion's den, not as a disgraced, discarded daughter begging for forgiveness, but as the ultimate executioner fully ready to deliver the final fatal blow. The long, grueling drive to the Hamptons gave me plenty of silent time to mentally prepare for the massive storm I was about to walk directly into. The scenic highway was usually a pleasant time for wealthy vacationers to admire the sprawling coastal views, but today the gray churning water matched my cold, calculating mood. I navigated my sensible sedan slowly down the familiar, winding private roads passing towering, manicured hedges and wrought iron gates that guarded the summer homes of the city's absolute elite. When I finally pulled up to the sprawling Marcus family estate, the immediate visual cues of sudden, catastrophic financial ruin were entirely impossible to ignore. The pristine, massive circular driveway, usually a flawless showcase for my family's absurd, flaunted wealth, looked exactly like an active crime scene. Preston's fleet of flashy imported sports cars, a matte black Lamborghini, and a cherry red Ferrari that Victoria flaunted constantly to her millions of followers on social media were parked haphazardly at odd angles. But they were no longer aggressive symbols of absolute status. Plastered across the driver's side windshield of each luxury vehicle was a massive, highly visible neon yellow bank repossession sticker. The bright, garish yellow clashed violently against the sophisticated manicured backdrop of the expensive landscaping. I parked my simple car neatly next to a towering oak tree, taking a slow, incredibly steadying breath. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, feeling the solid, massive weight of the complete audit files resting securely inside. This mansion was no longer a home to me. It was a corporate crime scene, and I was holding the exact murder weapon. I aggressively pushed open the heavy, solid mahogany front doors, stepping directly into the grand foyer. The atmosphere inside was absolute, unadulterated chaos. The usual quiet, curated elegance of the massive house was shattered by the sound of my father screaming at the absolute top of his lungs. Marcus was pacing frantically back and forth across the custom, imported Persian rug in the sunken living room. His usually immaculate, tailored suit jacket was entirely discarded on a velvet chair. His expensive silk tie was violently loosened, and his crisp dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. Thick, prominent veins bulged dangerously along his neck and forehead as he roared furiously into his cell phone, aggressively barking impossible orders at someone who clearly had no power to help him. A few feet away, my mother Cassandra was a tragic portrait of shattered high society grace. She was huddled pathetically on the very edge of a white velvet sofa, wearing a silk dressing gown that looked out of place in the middle of the afternoon. Her hands were trembling so violently that the ice in her crystal glass clinked rapidly and loudly against the delicate sides. As she raised the glass to her lips, a generous splash of expensive amber scotch spilled heavily over the rim, completely staining the pristine white velvet upholstery. She did not even seem to notice the ruin. The invincible, utterly untouchable hospitality family was rapidly unraveling in real time. Marcus abruptly ended his call, slamming his expensive phone down onto a solid marble side table with enough sheer force to actively chip the expensive stone. He spun around, his broad chest heaving heavily, and finally locked his bloodshot eyes with me, standing quietly in the main entryway. He did not look relieved to see his daughter. He looked directly at me, exactly like a liquid financial asset he urgently needed to immediately liquidate. "It is about damn time you finally got here," Marcus snapped, his voice incredibly rough and ragged from shouting. He marched toward me, closing the distance with heavy, furious steps. Listen to me very carefully, Maya. The predatory banks are pulling a massively coordinated, illegal stunt. They have aggressively frozen all the corporate accounts and locked up the personal lines of credit. It is a temporary, highly annoying cash flow squeeze, but they are going viciously after Preston. We desperately need immediate liquid capital. I stood my absolute ground, my fingers gripping the leather handle of my briefcase tightly. And what exactly does Preston's temporary cash flow squeeze have to do with me? I am absolutely not asking for a favor. Marcus barked loudly, pointing a rigid, angry finger directly at my face. I am giving you direct instructions. You are going to liquidate your entire retirement savings today. Then you are going to go straight to your bank and forcefully pull a maximum equity line of credit directly against your apartment. Preston desperately needs a temporary legal bond, and he needs it wired to his massive defense attorney by the close of business tomorrow. I stared directly at him, letting a cold, utterly humorless scoff actively escape my lips. The sheer audacity was truly breathtaking. You actually want me to liquidate my entire savings? The exact same savings you mocked exactly 1 month ago. I asked, my voice slicing through his panic. You want the humble, pathetic, broke teacher's wife to massively bail out your genius, billionaire chief financial officer. Cassandra suddenly stood up from the stained velvet sofa, the ice clinking wildly in her heavy glass. She stepped rapidly forward, her face twisted in a truly desperate, pathetic attempt to actively manipulate the narrative. Maya, stop being so incredibly petty, she cried, her voice shrill and trembling violently. This is not the time to hold pathetic grudges about a wedding toast. This is entirely about family loyalty. We are talking about our historic hospitality legacy, Maya. We built a massive, historic empire, and you are going to just let some faceless banking predators violently tear it down because your fragile feelings are hurt? You have a duty to this family. You have an absolute duty to protect your sister. The thick hypocrisy was so incredibly heavy I could practically taste it in the stale air. I tightened my iron grip on my briefcase, my voice rapidly dropping to a surgical icy register. Family loyalty? I shot back aggressively, taking a slow, deliberate step directly toward her. You actually want to invoke family loyalty right now? Where was that exact loyalty when I was 12 years old? Do you vividly remember that night, Mother? I accidentally spilled juice on my dress 2 hours before your prestigious charity gala. Instead of helping me, you aggressively dragged me out the back door and legally locked me outside in the freezing rain so I would not ruin your perfect, curated society photographs. You literally let me stand there shivering in the dark while you smiled and posed beautifully with Victoria for the society pages. You have absolutely never been loyal to me. You are only loyal to the fake facade, and I am not bleeding myself dry to protect your fake, crumbling empire. My sharp words hit the room exactly like a physical shockwave. Cassandra gasped loudly, staggering back a full step and clutching a shaking hand to her chest as if she had been violently struck. She looked completely appalled that her absolute favorite go-to manipulation tactic had failed so spectacularly. Marcus, however, did not retreat. My open defiance actively ignited a volatile, massive, explosive rage deep inside him. He let out a furious animalistic roar and slammed his closed fist violently down onto the exact center of the massive, custom-glass coffee table. A loud, incredibly sharp crack echoed loudly through the cavernous living room as a deep fissure spiderwebbed across the thick glass surface. You ungrateful, insolent little girl, Marcus roared, his face turning an alarming, terrifying shade of crimson. He stepped right up to me, his massive, imposing frame desperately trying to physically intimidate me into total submission. You honestly think you can just calmly walk away from this? You think you can casually stand there and lecture us while my massive company is under attack? If you do not sign that apartment over to me today, I will personally destroy that pathetic husband of yours. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and angry. You actually think a public school teacher is completely untouchable? I play elite golf every single Sunday with the wealthy superintendent of the city school board. I will make exactly one phone call, Maya. Just one. And Julian will be immediately fired before the absolute first bell rings tomorrow morning. He will be totally blacklisted. He will absolutely never teach in this state again. You will both be living in a cardboard box on the street. He stood there breathing heavily, a highly triumphant, incredibly cruel sneer actively forming on his lips. He firmly believed he had just played the absolute ultimate trump card. He actively thought he had found the exact perfect leverage he desperately needed to break me completely. Before Marcus could utter another violent threat, a heavy resounding thud suddenly echoed loudly from the very front of the house. The massive, solid oak front doors of the mansion swung aggressively open with a forceful, commanding presence that instantly silenced the massive room. Marcus spun rapidly around, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute shock. Julian stepped powerfully over the threshold and directly into the grand foyer. He was not wearing his typical tweed jacket or his sensible teacher loafers. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom charcoal gray bespoke suit that actively screamed quiet, devastating, immense power. And he was absolutely not alone, flanking my husband firmly on either side. Their shiny metallic badges, clearly and prominently visible securely on their belts, were two grim-faced federal agents. The sudden, impossible appearance of Julian in the grand foyer paralyzed the room. The heavy oak doors slowly clicked completely shut behind him, securely sealing us inside the sprawling mansion. Julian stood composed, radiating a quiet, incredibly terrifying authority. He did not look like the public school teacher my toxic family had relentlessly mocked at our wedding. He looked exactly like a man who owned the very ground he was casually standing on. For a fraction of a second, the absolute only sound in the cavernous living room was the ragged, heavy breathing of my father. Then the absolute shock wore off and Preston actively decided to play his usual pathetic role. Preston stepped aggressively forward, pushing past my sister Victoria, who was staring open-mouthed at the massive unexpected intrusion. He was sweating profusely, thick beads of moisture, gathering aggressively on his forehead and entirely ruining the crisp collar of his expensive Tom Ford shirt. Despite the highly visible, undeniable panic deeply in his eyes, he desperately tried to puff out his chest and forcefully project the arrogant persona he had carefully cultivated on my father's dime. He let out a loud, incredibly forced scoff, desperately attempting to diminish the undeniable massive threat standing calmly in the entryway. What exactly is this pathetic joke supposed to be? Preston sneered aggressively, his voice cracking slightly on the very last word. He pointed a violently trembling finger directly at Julian. Did the absolutely broke history teacher bring his little high school hall monitors to a billionaire's private house? You actually think you can just aggressively march into this secure estate and play dress-up? You are actively trespassing, Julian. You and your little pathetic rent-a-cops urgently need to turn around and walk right back out that door before I have the armed security immediately throw you off the island. Julian did not even blink. He completely ignored Preston, treating him entirely with the exact same dismissive, absolute silence that one might reserve for a tiny, buzzing insect. He did not offer a highly witty comeback or actively raise his voice to defend himself. His absolute, total stillness was far more intimidating than any screaming match could ever be. Julian simply turned his head slightly and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod directly to the men flanking him. The two armed federal agents moved with practiced, synchronized precision. They bypassed Julian and stepped directly down into the massive sunken living room, instantly aggressively invading the personal space Preston was trying so incredibly hard to defend. The lead agent smoothly reached inside his suit jacket and forcefully produced a thick, folded legal document actively bearing the official, undeniable seal of the United States Department of Justice. Preston Vance, the lead agent stated, his deep voice a flat, booming baritone that actively left no room for negotiation. We are executing a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. You are being officially charged with multiple counts of corporate wire fraud, aggressive money laundering, and the highly illegal embezzlement of corporate funds across international borders. the color rapidly, instantly drained from Preston's arrogant face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost completely trapped inside an expensive suit. His arrogant posture evaporated instantly. His knees buckled slightly and he stumbled aggressively backward, nearly tripping heavily over the edge of the custom Persian rug. He looked frantically around the massive room, his wide, entirely terrified eyes darting from the federal agents to Victoria and finally landing directly on my father. He was a man who had built his entire fake identity on the absolute protection and immense wealth of Marcus hospitality. And exactly now that shield was being violently ripped away. "Marcus, you have to actively do something," Preston pleaded loudly, his voice climbing an entire octave in pure, unadulterated panic. He threw his hands desperately up, gesturing wildly toward the agents. "Tell them they are making a massive mistake. Call your highly expensive legal team. Tell them to aggressively back off. I did absolutely nothing wrong. I was just restructuring our liquid assets. I was actively executing the aggressive investment strategy we explicitly talked about." My father stood frozen by the cracked glass coffee table, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled desperately to comprehend how his impregnable fortress was being aggressively breached. He didn't know who Julian truly was yet. Julian slowly, deliberately reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek, heavy matte black metal business card. The sharp edges were precisely defined, and a single embossed crest caught the light of the chandelier perfectly. With a smooth, incredibly effortless motion, Julian lightly tossed the heavy metal card directly onto the coffee table. It landed smoothly on the pristine glass, right next to the spider-webbed crack my father had just created, and actively slid smoothly across the surface until it stopped directly in front of Marcus's shaking hands. "You are more than welcome to try and crush my company in federal court, Marcus," Julian said, his voice actively dropping to a smooth, dangerous timbre that instantly commanded absolute obedience. "But I highly recommend you read that card before you make a frantic phone call you absolutely cannot afford." Marcus glared directly at Julian for a long, incredibly tense second, his broad chest still heaving with indignation. With a sharp, aggressive scoff of total dismissal, he looked directly down at the table and aggressively snatched the heavy black metal card off the cracked glass. He held it up to the bright light, his eyes narrowing sharply as he read the minimalist, elegant silver text precisely engraved on the surface. I stood silently beside my husband and watched the exact terrifying moment my father completely realized his entire world had just ended. Marcus stopped breathing, the aggressive, furious flush of color rapidly, instantly drained from his face, actively leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His massive shoulders, which had been thrown aggressively back in arrogant defiance just seconds ago, suddenly slumped deeply forward as if an invisible, crushing weight had been actively dropped directly onto his spine. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy metal card actively rattled against his gold wedding band. He stared intensely at the engraved text, his eyes wide and completely unblinking, his mind entirely failing to properly process the catastrophic, impossible paradigm shift. The arrogant man who had actively, publicly disowned me for marrying a nobody was now holding the undeniable, terrifying proof that he had just threatened to destroy the very man who currently held his entire $900 million empire directly in the palm of his hand. The text was minimalist, highly elegant, and impossible to misinterpret. It read, "Julian Vance, chairman of the board, Vanguard Heritage." The air seemed to completely, aggressively evacuate the sprawling mansion. Marcus looked slowly up from the heavy card, his terrified gaze finally deeply meeting Julian's. The blatant, aggressive disdain, the arrogant superiority, and the mocking condescension that had actively defined my father's attitude toward my husband for the past 2 years vanished entirely in an instant. In its place was a raw, unadulterated, suffocating terror that actively aged him a full decade in the exact span of a single heartbeat. "Julian," Marcus gasped weakly, his voice a pathetic, highly fragile whisper. Cassandra, sensing the radical violent shift in the massive power dynamic, stood slowly up from the stained white velvet sofa. She clutched her silk dressing gown incredibly tightly around her waist, taking a hesitant, completely fearful step forward. Her voice was a fragile, trembling whisper as she asked Marcus exactly what was wrong, desperately begging him to simply tell her what the card said. Marcus ignored her. He could not tear his terrified eyes away from the man he had just threatened to have fired from a public school. The highly powerful man he had arrogantly promised to leave completely destitute on the street. Julian finally broke the suffocating, deep silence. He did not aggressively raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet, resonant authority in his tone commanded the entire room, forcing everyone to actively listen with absolute, undivided attention. The mild-mannered, highly unassuming history teacher persona that Julian had so patiently maintained throughout our courtship, our wedding, and the ensuing months of familial abuse dissolved entirely, permanently. In his exact place stood the formidable, incredibly wealthy patriarch of a financial empire. Julian actively explained the reality of the situation, with a surgical precision that cut straight through Marcus's remaining weak defenses. He informed my terrified father that the Vance family absolutely did not build their massive wealth on aggressive, highly leveraged hospitality contracts or flashy, fake social media displays. His family represented real old money. They actively possessed the kind of quiet, foundational wealth that actively dictated global market trends, rather than pathetically reacting to them. Julian explained that he completely owned Vanguard Heritage entirely. It was a massive private family trust, and Julian sat at the absolute top of the global hierarchy, he stated, his voice completely devoid of any warmth, that he chose to actively teach public high school history not out of financial necessity or a lack of ambition, but out of a profound, unwavering sense of duty to shape the next generation. Julian built a massive legacy of education while sitting heavily on a fortune that could actively buy Marcus's entire fake company 10 times over. The arrogant public school teacher was the billionaire. The self-proclaimed business genius was effectively broke. But self-preservation is a powerful, highly desperate instinct. Marcus swallowed incredibly hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He aggressively shifted from the role of the terrifying executioner to the pathetic, begging businessman. He held his shaking hands up in a placating, subservient gesture. He frantically offered Julian a highly coveted senior seat directly on the Marcus Hospitality Executive Board. He desperately promised Julian unprecedented equity in the company, complete operational transparency moving forward, and a massive, guaranteed annual return that would dwarf whatever penalty interest Vanguard Heritage was currently expecting to collect. Julian let out a cold, sharp, devastating laugh that actively sent a visible shiver straight down my mother's spine. I absolutely do not aggressively handle the highly granular, tedious details of hostile corporate acquisitions, covenant breaches or default enforcements, Julian said, completely rejecting the desperate bribe. I leave all of those massive operational decisions up to my senior director of global asset recovery. Julian took a deliberate step backward, placing a warm, incredibly supportive hand firmly on my lower back. The gesture was a physical transfer of ultimate authority, a completely undeniable signal to everyone in the room that I was the exact one holding the keys to their survival. I was the absolute executioner. I entirely stepped forward. I actively reached down and unlatched the heavy brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp, highly metallic clicks echoed loudly. I pulled out a thick, meticulously bound legal file, actively bearing the deeply embossed metallic crest of Vanguard Heritage. I placed it onto the cracked glass table. "Hello, Dad," I said calmly. "I am the exact auditor who deeply analyzed your books. I am the exact one who actively discovered Preston's massive embezzlement. And I am the incredibly specific one who signed the executive order to freeze all Marcus Hospitality operating accounts at 6 o'clock this morning." The incredible silence that followed was absolute. It was the terrifying sound of a fake dynasty totally crumbling to absolute dust. Marcus stood completely paralyzed, mute. He realized he was staring directly at the brilliant daughter he had discarded, who now actively held his absolute survival precisely in her hand. I turned my deeply analytical gaze directly to Preston. The two heavily armed federal agents already had his arms firmly gripped. He was practically violently vibrating with terror. Sweat poured rapidly down his face. "You truly, honestly thought you were an absolute mastermind." "Preston," I said, my tone laced entirely with clinical disgust. "You actually aggressively believed you could actively outsmart institutional auditors by illegally categorizing your embezzlement as structural hotel upgrades. You operated with the staggering, massive arrogance of a highly foolish man who thought he was untouchable." No, it was a restructuring plan." Preston stuttered aggressively, his breathing panicked. "I had an incredibly brilliant plan to rapidly pay it back." "You completely lacked a plan." "You had a massive piggy bank," I countered instantly, my voice sharp and actively cutting. "You actively left a digital trail so incredibly glaringly obvious that an accounting intern could have aggressively caught it. You literally used the internal corporate VPN to execute the offshore transfers. You left a highly massive digital breadcrumb trail, Preston. The illegal funds in the Cayman accounts have already been permanently frozen by international authorities. You are bankrupt, and you are actively going to federal prison." Before the federal agent heavily locked the sharp steel handcuffs aggressively around Preston's wrists, Victoria actively lunged down the stairs into the living room. Her contoured face actively twisted into a highly volatile mask of pure unhinged wrath. "You aggressively planned this entirely out of spite." Victoria completely shrieked, actively trying to physically lunge at me. Julian firmly blocked her path perfectly. "You orchestrated this federal circus strictly because you are jealous of me. My incredibly brilliant husband elevated this family name. He actively provides a flawless, massive lifestyle. You are entirely making this up." I looked blankly at my delusional, incredibly arrogant sister. She was actively defending the fake reality she aggressively flaunted entirely on the internet. I reached calmly back into my briefcase and pulled out a highly standard, simple manila folder. I placed it firmly exactly on top of the Vanguard Heritage dossier. "You are actually right about one thing, Victoria," I stated, completely maintaining my surgical, terrifying calm. "Preston did not lose the $10 million in a massive failed corporate restructuring investment. He absolutely knew precisely what he was doing with that entirely stolen money." I flipped the folder completely open. Inside were detailed, brightly highlighted financial bank statements, certified property deeds, and heavily verified offshore wire transfer logs. The stolen money was carefully, aggressively, and intentionally redistributed, I explained, maintaining intense eye contact with her horrified, pale face. $2.4 million was actively wired completely directly to a prominent, incredible luxury real estate developer entirely in South Beach, Miami. The property deed to the incredibly massive, extremely expensive penthouse condo is not heavily registered in your specific name, Victoria. It is also not in Preston's name. The expensive property is legally, actively registered to a specific woman named Jasmine Carter. Victoria instantly stopped breathing, the aggressive, manic energy completely drained from her entire body. "And the absolute massive rest of the incredibly embezzled funds," I continued, my voice entirely unyielding, "were funneled into a massive, irrevocable offshore trust fund. A secretive trust fund that Preston actively set up exactly 4 months ago, right around the exact incredibly specific time you actively posted those curated, entirely fake anniversary photos from Rome. The sole exclusive beneficiary is Jasmine Carter. Preston did not steal from our father to build your fake, massive, perfect life. He actively stole to completely fund a secret secondary life exactly with his mistress." Victoria let out a strangled, entirely breathless gasp. She actively lunged completely forward, snatching the thick stack of papers right out of the open folder. She stared at the undeniable transactions, the certified Miami deed, and the extremely glossy photographs of the extremely massive penthouse. Her flawless, perfect marriage actively shattered into a million irreparable pieces exactly in her shaking hands. Preston instantly panicked heavily. He actively cried heavily, begging for forgiveness entirely as the federal agents began actively physically hauling him away exactly toward the massive double doors and handcuffs. The absolute Miami property has exactly already been seized by the federal government. The loud lead FBI agents strictly announced, fully ignoring Preston's pathetic, loud whining. Victoria's expensive designer knees buckled entirely. She collapsed onto the expensive stained Persian rug, loudly, violently, actively weeping, exactly as she realized exactly she was now exactly the broke wife of an exactly convicted felon. The empire was officially dead. The complex financial execution was complete, but Cassandra could not endure the terrifying silence. Witnessing the complete, total breakdown of her golden child weeping on the carpet, watching her favored son-in-law being dragged away in handcuffs, and realizing that the specific daughter she had relentlessly abused was exactly now the single most powerful person in the room, finally forced my toxic mother to act. She could not use fake money to control me anymore. She could not use her elite social status to intimidate me. She only had exactly one single weapon left in her arsenal. Cassandra slowly stood up from the ruined white sofa. She wiped a single perfect tear from her meticulously contoured cheek, her flawless face shifting into a mask of profound, tragic suffering. She ignored the FBI agents and she ignored her weeping daughter on the floor. She stepped carefully over the scattered financial documents and walked directly toward me. She reached out her trembling hands, desperately attempting to grasp mine, playing the ultimate toxic manipulation card she had kept in heavy reserve for 2 decades. She was actively preparing to crush me with the suffocating weight of a fabricated mother's sacrifice. "Maya, my sweet, brilliant girl," Cassandra whispered, her manicured voice quivering with a fragile, manufactured vulnerability. She squeezed my hands, attempting to pull me intensely closer. "You have to carefully listen to me. You have to look directly into your mother's loving heart and deeply understand exactly why things were the way they were. I know I was hard on you. Every harsh criticism, every time I favored your sister, it was a test. It was exactly my loving way of protecting you. I was giving you the heavy armor you needed to survive." When my cold expression remained unchanged, a wall of pure, impenetrable ice, she pivoted seamlessly. She abandoned the weak, tough love routine and invoked a higher, almost sacred cause to actively shield her own rampant greed. "You are destroying our family legacy," Cassandra pleaded heavily, her shrill voice echoing off the ceilings. "Your brilliant father built a huge beacon of absolute excellence. You are going to burn it to the ground because you felt left out of a few minor family dinners. You are handing our generational wealth over to faceless federal agents over a pathetic misunderstanding." I looked down at her manicured hands tightly gripping my calm wrists. I did not yank them away, I simply and smoothly detached myself. "You did not push me to be stronger. You pushed me away because I was not a useful, photogenic accessory for your elite country club newsletters," I said. My flat voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp surgical edge that sliced straight through her manufactured tears. "You do not care about a legacy. You care about your expensive front row seats at the annual charity galas. You care about making sure your elite society friends think you are royalty." Marcus Hospitality ceased to be a functioning business 3 full years ago. It became a personal, illicit slush fund to finance your desperate, pathetic need to be the queen of the social scene. I traced the origin of every single stolen dollar. Your $100,000 initiation fee for the elite Oak Point Country Club. Preston diverted that from the company's regional warehouse maintenance budget, I stated, breaking deeply down her entire fake existence into cold, unforgiving ledger entries. When I signed the executive order to freeze Marcus Hospitality operating accounts at exactly 6 o'clock this morning, I did not just freeze the corporate payroll. I froze every single account linked to the shadow routing numbers Preston set up to autopay all your personal elite expenses. The blood drained from Cassandra's contoured face. "Every single one of your membership payments bounced precisely this morning," I revealed, my voice steady and utterly merciless. "And because Vanguard Heritage protocols required me to formally notify the receiving institutions of the ongoing federal fraud investigation, your memberships are fully revoked. By tomorrow morning, every single woman you spent the last decade trying to impress will know you are bankrupt." and funding your fake lifestyle with stolen money. Cassandra staggered backward, clutching her chest. The complete loss of her elite status broke her. She collapsed actively back onto the ruined velvet sofa, weeping loudly. Marcus watched his wife break down over the loss of her gala tickets while his empire burned. The proud, tyrannical patriarch could not bear the weight of his failure. He dropped to his knees, utterly broken. He looked up at me, his voice a raspy, broken whisper. "Please, Maya, I built that company with my bare hands," he begged. "I will give you everything. Just unfreeze the accounts, call off the default. Do you remember my wedding day?" "Dad?" I asked calmly. "You brought a heavy stack of legal documents. Do you remember the waiver you forced me to sign?" Marcus nodded frantically, his eyes widening. "Yes, Maya, the waiver, but we can void that contract right now. I will draft a reinstatement." "It does not matter anymore," I replied smoothly. "Because it already served its purpose. Vanguard Heritage adheres to the strictest anti-corruption regulations. An auditor cannot investigate a corporation owned by their immediate family. If I were still legally tied to your estate, Vanguard would have flagged my assignment and forced me to recuse myself. But I was not flagged." I paused, letting the silence wrap around him. "Because of the waiver. By forcing me to sign away my rights, you formally and legally severed me from your estate. You legally dissolved my status as a beneficiary and officially categorized me as an independent financial entity. You removed the conflict of interest. You thought you were punishing me," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, triumphant finality. "You actually handed me the exact legal clearances I needed to dismantle your entire empire. You orchestrated your own destruction." I turned my back on him, Julian took my hand, and together we walked toward the exit. I did not look back, not even once. The heavy doors closed behind us, sealing the broken patriarch and his weeping family inside their ruined fortress. True worth is never defined by those who repeatedly belittle you, even if they happen to share your blood. The ultimate takeaway is that genuine family is built on mutual respect, not just genetics. When toxic relatives attempt to diminish your light, the greatest revenge is not found in screaming matches. It is found in building an extraordinarily successful, fiercely independent life on your own terms. Share your own empowering experiences of setting boundaries with toxic family members in the comments section below. And hit that subscribe button for more stories of strength, survival, and ultimate success.